Good morning. This is Ron, and it is Tuesday, May the 1st. Welcome to Story Time. So, this morning, the thing that my monologue is going to be about statistics and the misuse of statistics by news people. It used to be that when a news department, and again, this is back in the days when the news people and the news departments only cared about integrity and credibility so that they would be able to have maximum influence in society. They weren't a for profit business. Now that they've become a for profit and they no longer care about their integrity or their credibility, they kind of they're sloppy about the way they do things. I think actually a lot of it is deliberate sloppiness. And this is one of the subtle ways in which they're sloppy. And it has to do with statistics. And I'm not going to sit and argue with them about whether or not they may have claimed to survey or poll 1,000 people. Well, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I don't know. I don't care. What the important point is the message that they're bringing across very subtly that they didn't used to. That there's a change. The way it used to be done was a survey would be conducted, and they would say, according to such and such polling department, or let's say a university that went ahead and conducted the survey, they surveyed 1,000 people, and of those 1,000 people, X amount of percentage agreed, X amount of percentage disagreed, and a certain percentage opted out or didn't know, right? Now, today, they say when there's a poll or survey done, there's 1,000 people that are surveyed, they'll say, a new survey has come out that says 65% of Americans think X, or 55% of Americans like this, or 51% of Americans approve of the job the president is doing. And the difference is, in the second instance, it's a blatant, or actually a rather subtle attempt to intimidate people. In the first one, it's accurate. Okay, they're coming out and saying, of those surveyed, 51% think this or 20% think that, not trying to represent that the 1,000 people represent the thoughts of all 360 million Americans, because that's simply ridiculous. 1,000 people is not a representative sampling of 360 million people. It would be equivalent to going to Pasadena with a population of 200,000, picking two people, surveying them, and then saying, oh, on the basis of the survey, this is what the people of Pasadena think. It's just BS. So that's what the news people should be doing, is saying, of those surveyed, certain percentage think this, and instead uh, of all Americans, a certain percentage think this. That Americans have a 51% approval rating of the President of the United States, for instance, when they've only surveyed 1,000 people. And what they should be saying, if they want to be honest and maintain their integrity and credibility, is that of those surveyed, 51% approve of the president. So that's something to listen for when you're being given statistics. Okay, so when I come back, it's going to be the last chapter of Ayn Rand's philosophy, Who Needs It? Okay, and we're back. And I wanted to, before I continue, I wanted to emphasize that something that I've mentioned before, but I should be getting in the habit of saying this every time I broadcast, and that is that this show is geared not to professionals, even though it may be talking about subjects that are of concern to professionals. It is not geared to professionals. It's not geared to the lawyers. It's not geared to the philosophers. Anybody with a master's degree and up, this is not geared to them. And it is geared to the butchers, the bakers, and the candlestick makers of our society. So, now, chapter 18 of Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy Who Needs It, called Don't Let It Go, written in 1971. In order to form a hypothesis about the future of an individual, one must consider three elements: his present course of action, his conscious convictions, and his sense of life. The same elements must be considered in forming a hypothesis about the future of a nation. A sense of life is a preconceptual equivalent of metaphysics, an emotional, subconsciously integrated appraisal of man and of existence. It represents an individual's undefined philosophy, which can be identified and corrected if necessary. It affects his choice of values and his emotional responses, influences his actions, and frequently clashes with his conscious convictions. For a detailed discussion, see Philosophy and Sense of Life in my book, The Romantic Manifesto. A nation, like an individual, has a sense of life, which is expressed not in its formal culture, but in its lifestyle, in the kinds of actions and attitudes which people take for granted and believe to be self-evident, but which are produced by complex evaluations involving a fundamental view of man's nature. A nation is not a mystic or supernatural entity. It is a large number of individuals who live in the same geographical locality under the same political system. A nation's culture is the sum of the intellectual achievement of individual men, which their fellow citizens have accepted in whole or in part, and which have influenced the nation's way of life. Since a culture is a complex battleground of different ideas and influences, to speak of a culture is to speak only of the dominant ideas, always allowing for the existence of dissenters and exceptions. The dominance of certain ideas is not necessarily determined by the number of their adherents. It may be determined by majority acceptance, or by the greater activity and persistence of a given faction, or by default, i.e., the failure of the opposition, or, when a country is free, by a combination of persistence and truth. In any case, ideas and the resultant culture are the product and active concern of a minority. Who constitutes this minority? Whoever chooses to be concerned. Similarly, the concept of a nation's sense of life does not mean that every member of a given nation shares it, but only that a dominant majority shares its essentials in various degrees. In this matter, however, the dominance is numerical. While most men may be indifferent to cultural ideological trends, no man can escape the process of subconscious integration which forms his sense of life. A nation's sense of life is formed by every individual child's early impressions of the world around him, of the idea he is taught, which he may or may not accept, and of the way of acting he observes and evaluates, which he may evaluate correctly or not. And although there are exceptions at both ends of the psychological spectrum, men whose sense of life is better, truer philosophically, or worse than that of their fellow citizens, the majority develop the essentials of the same subconscious philosophy. This is the source of what we observe as national characteristics. A nation's political trends are the equivalent of a man's course of action and are determined by its culture. A nation's culture is the equivalent of a man's conscious convictions. Just as an individual's sense of life can clash with his conscious convictions, hampering or defeating his actions, so a nation's sense of life can clash with its culture, hampering or defeating its political course. Just as an individual's sense of life can be better or worse than his conscious convictions, so can a nation's. And just as an individual who has never translated his sense of life into conscious convictions is in terrible danger, no matter how good his subconscious values, so is a nation. This is the position of America today. If America is to be saved from destruction, specifically from dictatorship, she will be saved by her sense of life. As to the two other elements that determine a nature's future, one, our political trend, is speeding straight to disaster. The other, culture, is virtually non-existent. A couple of quick comments here. Again, this is one of the areas where Ayn Rand unfortunately contradicts herself. She has been on the record in many of her other books as saying that the universe is benevolent and that success is to be expected. If that's the case, then there's no way the country can be just speeding towards disaster. That we may be speeding toward a conflicts of some sort, but eventually we're going to be able to, if this is truly a benevolent universe, work out those conflicts and work them out to our betterment. And then she says a culture which is virtually non-existent. Well, it isn't. It's not true. We have a culture, but it's dominated by the left, by American counterculture and countercultural influences. Let's see. The political trend is pure statism and is moving toward a totalitarian dictatorship at a speed which in any other country would have reached that goal long ago. The culture is worse than non existent. It is operating below zero, i.e., performing the opposite of its function. A culture provides a nation's intellectual leadership, its ideas, its education, its moral code. Today, the concerted effort of our cultural establishment is directed at the obliteration of man's rational faculty. Hysterical voices are proclaiming the impotence of reason, extolling the superpower of irrationality, fostering the rule of incoherent emotions, attacking science, glorifying the stupor of drugged hippies, delivering apologies for the use of brute force, urging mankind's return to a life of rolling in primeval muck, with grunts and groans as means of communication, physical sensations as means of inspiration, and a club as a means of argumentation. This country, with its magnificent scientific and technological power, is left in the vacuum of a pre-intellectual era, like the wandering hordes of the Dark Ages, or in the position of an adolescent before he has fully learned to conceptualize. But an adolescent has his sense of life to guide his choices. So has this country. What is the specifically American sense of life? A sense of life is so complex in integration that the best way to identify it is by means of concrete examples and by contrast with the manifestations of a different sense of life. The emotional keynote of most Europeans is the feeling that man belongs to the state as a property to be used and disposed of in compliance with his natural, metaphysically determined fate. A typical European may disapprove of a given state and may rebel, seeking to establish what he regards as a better one, like a slave who might seek a better master to serve. But the idea that he is the sovereign and the government is his servant has no emotional reality in his consciousness. He regards service to the state as an ultimate moral sanction, as an honor. And if you told him that his life is an end in itself, he would feel insulted or rejected or lost. Generations brought up on statist philosophy and acting accordingly have implanted this in his mind from the earliest formative years of his childhood. A typical American can never fully grasp that kind of feeling. An American is an independent entity. The popular expression of protest against being pushed around is emotionally unintelligible to Europeans who believe that to be pushed around is their natural condition. Emotionally, an American has no concept of service or servitude to anyone. Even if he enlists in the army and hears it called service to his country, his feeling is that of a generous aristocrat who chose to do a dangerous task. A European soldier feels that he is doing his duty. Isn't my money as good as the next fellow's? Used to be a popular American expression. It would not be popular in Europe. A fortune, to be good, must be old and derived by special favor from the state. To a European, money earned by personal effort is vulgar, crude, or somehow disreputable. Americans admire achievement. They know what it takes. Europeans regard achievement with cynical suspicion and envy. Envy is not a widespread emotion in America, not yet. It is an overwhelmingly dominant emotion in Europe. When Americans feel respect for their public figures, it is the respect of equals. They feel that a government official is a human being just as they are, who has chosen this particular line of work and has earned a certain distinction. They call celebrities by their first names. They refer to presidents by their initials, like FDR or JFK, not in insolence or egalitarian pretentiousness, but in token of affection. The custom of addressing a person as Herr Doctor, Dr. Schmidt, would be impossible in America. In England, the freest country of Europe, the achievement of a scientist, a businessman, or a movie star is not regarded as fully real until he has been clunked on the head with the state sword and declared to be a knight. There are practical consequences of these two different attitudes. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it there at this chapter 18, Don't Let It Go, part 1. And when I come back, a little critique of Rush Limbaugh. Okay, so we're back, and this is going to be a critique of his show from April 30th, yesterday. And it is a segment called The University of Texas to Treat Masculinity as a Mental Health Issue. Let's see. So, let's see. We'll just go ahead and start from the beginning. Rush. Ever since I printed the story out on April 28th, Saturday night, I've been chomping at the bit. Want to hear the headline? University of Texas to treat masculinity as a mental health issue. The Counseling and Mental Health Center at the University of Texas at Austin recently launched a new program to help male students take control over their gender identity and develop a healthy sense of masculinity. So let's see. What do they mean by gender identity? No answer. What is a healthy sense of masculinity? Also, no answer. Treating masculinity as if it were a mental health crisis, Masculine UT is organized by the school's counseling staff and most recently organized a poster series encouraging students to develop a healthy model of masculinity. And again, what does that mean? No answer. The program is predicated on a critique of so-called restrictive masculinity, which means what? No answer. Men, the program argues, suffer when they're told to act like a man or when they are encouraged to fulfill traditional gender roles, such as being successful or the breadwinner. And so, which men is it that are suffering? Is it all men or just some of the men? No answer. This is corrupting men. It's destroying men. It's putting too much pressure on men. Again, is it corrupting, destroying, or putting too much pressure on all men or just some men? And what do you mean by corrupting, destroying, and putting too much pressure on? What's the right amount of pressure? No answer. Masculinity is causing men to crack up. What does that mean? No answer. The demand that they be successful, the demand that they provide for the family, the very idea that they should act like a man is tearing them apart, and we need to do something about it. And that all that means what? No answer. Though you might enjoy taking care of people or being active, Masculine UT warns that many of these attributes are actually dangerous. Why? No answer. Claiming that traditional ideas of masculinity place men into rigid or restrictive boxes, preventing them from developing their emotional maturity. So what? No answer. What are the odds that a bunch of women are running this, or at least provided the germination of the idea? Anyways, so my point here is that this whole program is at the university, assuming that Russia's presented this correctly, at the University of Texas at Austin, is arbitrary. It's an arbitrary program. They don't provide any answers to the questions that I've posed. It's not a program that's specifically to address a specific mental health issue. Men that are neurotic because they have a hard time dealing with masculine pressures of being the breadwinner and that kind of thing. Getting a little bit more specific. Who are we talking about? What are your definitions of even being a breadwinner? What is that supposed to mean? Meaning the sole breadwinner or a breadwinner along with your spouse? And if being a breadwinner is too restrictive and too much pressure, why would it be only too much pressure for a man and not too much pressure for a woman? Why would it not make a woman crack up? We don't know. No answers to those questions. But it's arbitrary. And the point of that is that this is where conservatives go very, very wrong. Rush Limbaugh thinks he's doing a service. He's rooted through all the newspapers, and he came up with this particular article. Let me see if I can find It just says, want to hear the headline. It doesn't even say what newspaper he got it out of. University of Texas to treat masculinity. So he's rooting through his newspapers and probably given to him by his staff and substitute for true program prep. He just goes through the headlines, or maybe even his staff just puts it in the stack of stuff, and then he just goes through it as he wants to during the broadcast. But he picks up this particular article and he thinks, aha, I need to alert my listeners to this. They need to know about this. And in reality, no, they don't. It's an arbitrary program, and he is aiding and abetting the left here, assuming that this is a left-wing program, which I assume it is. It reeks of post-Marxism. It reeks of trying to create social friction, trying to irritate and annoy people, probably for the most part men, trying to irritate and annoy men, and in an effort again to achieve ultimately socialist paradise. But he is aiding and abetting this effort. If you just leave it alone and ignore it, I would have never heard about it. And millions of his viewers or listeners would have never heard about it either. And that's exactly the way it should be. Because again, arbitrary statements, arbitrary arguments, arbitrary questions, arbitrary programs must be ignored. Because if you don't ignore them, then you embellish them. You promote them. And you're promoting again, you're promoting the arbitrary. You're helping the left. You're carrying the water for the left and helping them to irritate and annoy people, and to do so. And you're doing it really for no particular good reason. So it's Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity does this all the time, where they go out and find some obscure event to share with their audience, and in so doing, they're actually helping to promote left-wing, particularly cultural issues. So shame on for Rush Limbaugh for doing that and falling into that trap. And let's hope that he's going to learn from this lesson someday and let the arbitrary arguments, let the arbitrary statements go by unremarked. Okay, when we come back, it's going to be time for the New York City Cab Driver's Joke Book. Okay, so again, it is the New York City Cab Driver's Joke Book by Jim Peach. A mole, M-O-H-E-L, the man who performs circumcisions in a Jewish ceremony, is retiring after 45 years of service. Throughout his career, after each circumcision, he has put the little piece of foreskin in his wallet, taken it home, and saved it. Over the years, he's collected many huge bags full of these skins. And now that he's retiring, he decides that he would like to have something made from them. He goes to the best leather designer he can find and tells him, I would like for you to take these skins and make something out of them that will represent my career and commemorate my long service to the synagogue. So the designer says to him, this is a very unusual request, but I'll be happy to work on such a meaningful project as this. I will use all my skills as a designer and will make something for you that will be a symbol of all your years of dedication. I'm rather busy right now, but I think I can have this done for you in about 3 weeks. 3 weeks later, the mole returns. The leather worker is very happy to see him and with a flourish presents him with a small box. As the mole opens the box, he looks somewhat crestfallen. A wallet, he says. A small wallet is all I have to show for my many years of service? But, my friend, says the man, this is no ordinary wallet. If you rub it, it becomes a suitcase. A man got into my cab one evening. He was middle-aged and distinguished-looking in a friendly sort of way. When I asked him if he'd heard any good jokes, he told me this one. A group of philosophy professors is traveling on a train in Scotland. They look out the window and see black sheep grazing on the hillside. One of the men remarks, Gee, I didn't know that sheep in Scotland were black. But another of the philosophers said, Well, you really can't say that. You can only say that one sheep in Scotland is black. In fact, all you can say is that one side of one sheep in Scotland is black. Yet another of the group adds, well, really, all you can say is that one side of one sheep in Scotland is black some of the time. After hearing this joke, I said to myself, this guy likes subtlety, a thinking man's jokester. So I returned with this joke. Question: do you know what the sadist said to the masochist? Answer: absolutely nothing. He laughed and told me this one. A medical student is taking a test, and one of the questions is, name the 3 best advantages of mother's milk. The student immediately writes, 1, it has all the healthful nutrients needed to sustain a baby. 2, it is inside the mother's body and therefore protected from germs and infections. But the student can't think of the third answer. Finally, he writes, 3, it comes in such nice containers. I then countered with this. The optimist says this is the best of all possible worlds. The pessimist says, you're right. The gentleman in the back seat beat me to the punchline on that one. He then told me this one. This is a Russian fable. Once there was a man walking along a country road in the dead of winter. There was snow and ice all around. The man, not having a warm enough coat, was shivering and hurrying to get home. As he was walking, he happened to look down and see a little bird lying next to the road, all stiff, and with his feet sticking straight up in the air. Feeling sorry for it, he bent over, picked it up, and put it inside his shirt next to his body, hoping that the warmth might help to bring it around. After about half an hour, he felt a little flutter on his skin, and was very happy that the bird was still living. But the man knew that what the bird really needed was warmth, something he himself could not provide. Just then he happened to be walking by a cow pasture, and there, not too far from the road, was a steaming load that the cow just dropped. The man joyfully realized this could provide the warmth that the bird so desperately needed. So he went over, stuck the bird in the steaming pile. As he walked away, he felt very happy with the thought that perhaps he had saved this little creature's life. And sure enough, very soon the bird was revived by the warmth. He was so happy to be still alive that he let out a long, clear song of joy. Now a fox happened to be stalking nearby, heard the song, and followed it to the bird and ate him. Of course, every Russian fable has a moral, and this one has 3. 1, it's not always your enemies who get you into it. 2, it's not always your friends who get you out. And 3, if you're in it up to your neck, don't open your mouth. And that'll conclude today's episode of Story Time. And until tomorrow, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.